Hey guys, not Rubik here. Welcome to the first tutorial in a series that will teach you how to make a custom client object from scratch. This series is meant for people who want to expand beyond the basic JTOH kit and want to make their own custom client objects. It's worth noting before we get into this that only JTOH verified builders can submit custom client objects in their towers. But most fan games will let you submit custom client objects in your tower submissions, just so long as they're stable and won't be glitchy. This first video will not require any scripting knowledge, but the rest of the videos in this series will require a basic understanding of how programming in Roblox Studio works. If you do not know how to do that, I've linked some resources in the description. Each tutorial will be marked with a color in the bottom corner that signifies how difficult the content is to grasp, especially scripting-wise. Green means it's pretty easy to understand, pretty easy to learn if you already have a basic understanding of how Studio works. Yellow means it might take a little bit more time to fully grasp. You might need to practice it a little bit more, but you should still be good to go. Tutorials marked with red are, in my opinion, some of the more difficult stuff we'll be covering. Still something you can grasp if you put time into it and practice the skills in the tutorial, but they're not super easy to grasp at first. This tutorial series is designed so that if you watch all the videos and you do all the practices, you should be able to perform all the things taught in these tutorials without too much difficulty. These tutorials sort of build on each other. So while you don't have to watch the tutorials in order, you might be a little bit lost if you skip ahead. So just keep that in mind if you choose to watch the series out of order. There's also a document attached to this video that will outline all of my ideas for this tutorial series. And if you have any comments or suggestions, please feel free to leave them below. With that, let's get into this first tutorial. So in this tutorial, we're going to be talking about what a client object actually is, the difference between a server-sided object and a client-sided object, the basics of the LocalPartScript, and how the JTOH kit functions on a very basic level, how to make a scripted or unscripted client-sided object, and what counts as a custom client object. Now that might sound like a lot, but I promise you this stuff is pretty basic and shouldn't be too hard to understand for this first tutorial. And again, scripting knowledge is not required for this first tutorial. All right, so let's get right into this. So first of all, I have an example that kind of demonstrates the difference between what a client-sided object is and what a server-sided object is. All right, in this example, we have a basic setup where we have a button right here that's neon, and it will turn this part red when we touch it with our character. Both of these do the same thing, but on this side it's done on the client, and on this side it's done on the server. So as you can see, I have player 1 and player 2 right here. These are meant to signify different players in the game. So as you can see, when I press this as player 1, the part turns red for me on the client, but it does not change color at all for player 2 because we are not on player 1's client. However, if we come over here and player 1 touches this button and it'll turn this part red, it turns it red for both player 1 and player 2 because this interaction is happening on the server. All right, and for example 2, we have a tilting platform. As you can see, if I jump on here as player 2, it could be player 1, player 2, doesn't matter. But this part will move for me as player 2, but on player 1's side, it's not moving at all. Now something else happens. If we go over to the server side one, if one of these players jumps on here, it will move for both player 1 and player 2 with a slight delay because it's contacting the server and then going back down. So it takes a little longer to update the position. But the point is, it moves here for one character, but not the others. So to understand why these interactions are happening, let's first look at how the server replicates to the other clients. So if we move this part on the server, it will also move for the two clients. And this is called replication. The two clients are sort of asking the server where the part is and then moving it respectively. If you remember for our first example, we had a color changing part, and that used a client-sided script. the script can tell the client on the client side to change the color to red when the player hits the button. So it changes the color to red. And what you'll notice here is it changes the color to red on the client or the player side, but that doesn't actually change for other players. So the server is still a normal gray part. On the other client, it's still a normal gray part. We can actually move this part around, do whatever we want to it. But if the server script said something to change, all the properties would instantly snap back, because as soon as a property changes on the server part, it gets replicated to the client, and all that happens. So on our first example, on the client part, it changes to red. So the script is telling it to change to red when it touches the part, so it changes to red. And you'll see it doesn't happen for the second client, it only happens for its first client. In our other case, the player touches it, and that changes on the server because it's a server-sided script. So when it changes to red on the server, it replicates over to both clients, which is why even though only this player touched the part, since it was server-sided, it changed on the server, it went to both of the client parts. In our second example, where we had our physics object, we had our tilting platform, and the part was tilting on the client side. And since it was only doing it on the client side, since it's a client-sided object, or the player side, remember client just means player, it only happens for our first player and not our second player because this is a client physics event. However, when we are doing it with our server and we rotate the part, because it's server-sided, it changes for both clients. So even though it's just one player touching it, it changes for both. I hope that kind of cleared things up a little bit with what a client-sided object is versus what a server-sided object is. I can still understand if that's maybe still a little confusing because this stuff isn't super easy to understand at first. All you got to know is if it happens on the client, it does not affect other clients. If it happens on the server, it does affect all of the clients or all of the players. So something happens on the server, all the players, things get moved. And so that's also why we use client-sided objects when we do towers, because we don't want what happens on one player's side. Let's say they touch a button over here. So they touch a button on their side. We don't want it to activate for other players because then they'd get an advantage. So let's say like Tower of Terrifying Beauty, for example. If someone pressed the button at the top of the tower, that activates the win pad. If that button was server-sided, then that button would activate the win pad for any single person who joins the tower, and then they'd immediately win. So there's a lot of reasons why we use client-sided objects. One of them is to stop other players from getting an advantage, and the other one is physics are more accurate, and yeah, but that's why we don't actually use normal server-sided scripts when we're working with client-sided objects, because this works on the server and will affect every single person. So how do we make our own client object? Well, that's simple. We just got to take one of these parts out of the JTOE kit and go over to the Explorer here, and you're going to want to change its parent to be in the client-sided objects tab. I'm using kit v5.5 for this tutorial. It does not matter which version of the kit you use. In later tutorials, I might reference client objects that are maybe out of date from your version of the kit. That's fine. Any kit will work for this, really. All of them do the same thing when it comes to client objects. We have this part. It's in the client-sided objects folder now, but we're not done. We need to tell the kit that this is a client-sided object. And what I mean by tell the kit, I mean there's a script. If we go over to starter player, it's in starter player script. So this script right here, it's kind of a long script. But basically all it does is it makes the client-sided objects only work on a client and not on the server. So it converts whatever's in here to being on a client-side object. So we have to tell that script that this is a client-sided object. So by doing that, we add a bool value, and we name this bool value client object. Now this won't do anything if you don't have the JTOE kit or some equivalent installed in your studio. This doesn't actually tell Studio at all that this is a client-sided object or Roblox at all. It's read in the LocalPartScript. So now this part is client-sided. If we hit play right now, which I'm not going to do, and we hit unanchor, whatever, only one player would be able to interact with this. Client-sided objects also don't need to be just in one part. If we group this, we're going to actually delete the spool value. So now this is a model, and we make multiple parts, whatever. And then on the model, we create a bool value, and we name this bool value client object. Now this whole thing will be read as one client object because it's parented to the model. Basically, it goes to the model up here, and then it loops through all the parts and says, okay, add each of these to be a client object. So this one thing right here will be counted as one client object, and each of these are also client objects, if that makes sense. So this right here would count as a unscripted client object because there's no script that tells this thing to do anything. Now, unscripted client objects are usually going to be your physics objects. So we go over here to the spinner. We can see that it has the client object value, and it has one unanchored part and one normal part. And there's no scripts here that tell it how to move. It just moves via constraints, which we'll learn about in a later tutorial. Same thing with a rope platform. Same thing with a rope swing. Now, a falling platform actually is scripted because when the part where it falls is not scripted, but when it comes back up, that is a script telling it to come back up. So I think unscripted client objects are cool, but you can't really do too much with them. You can only really use constraints to make a move. So when you add scripts to the mix, things get a lot more interesting. So if we first, to add a script, we do not do script. Because as I said before, this is a server-sided script. Whatever happens in here is going to happen for everyone. We also are not going to use a local script. Now, scripters might be kind of confused because, yes, local scripts do run on the client side, but they do not run in workspace. So even though it's a client local script, if I said script.parent.color equals like red, obviously this isn't how you actually change a part's color, but it wouldn't do anything because it's a local script. Those do not run in workspace. What is our options if we can't use a normal script or a local script? Well, that just leaves one thing, a module script. We have this module script, and we're going to name it client object script. And it needs to be named client object script for anything to actually work. And as I said before, this isn't Roblox reading the script. Roblox doesn't have client objects built in like this. This is, again, going to be our LocalPartScript. As you can see, it's actually using a script runner, and it's going to be checking for a module script and then running the script. So this thing is running in player scripts, but it runs in the context of the client object script. Now, I promised I wasn't going to be scripting this video, but I do want to show you how to sort of prepare a module script for it to run, just so you can have an understanding of what this script does, even if you don't know scripting as a whole. So in this client object script, we're going to be saying, we're going to delete this pre-made code, and we're going to say return function in parentheses, and then we're going to hit enter, and they'll automatically create an end for us. So all of our code that we write in a client object is going to be written between these two things. We write code in here, yada, 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 yada. And we don't ever write code past this line because it is not going to be read. So don't write code there. You write code in this middle part right here. You can actually declare functions, like if I said local var equals 0 or whatever, you can declare your variables and functions outside of this return function, but all of your code that gets executed is going to be within here. It's really a style thing if you want to declare variables in here or not. That's all I can really think of as far as client object script goes. Obviously, we're going to go way farther in depth into what you can do with these things later on in the series, but for now, this is all the knowledge you need to know. Write all your code in here. It's good practice. You can write code out of here, but I wouldn't recommend it. You can run into some weird bugs. Anyway, before I end this tutorial out, I want to talk about exactly what a custom client object is. Probably should have defined this a little earlier. A custom client object is a client object that uses code not found in the JTOKit. On a case-by-case basis, you can modify client objects in the kit to have small use changes, but I would recommend checking with a J2H curator on whether or not that's going to be considered a custom client object. Anything that isn't scripted, that uses physics, such as a rope platform or anything that uses constraints, or just simply an unanchored part that has the client object value, that is going to be okay. That's most likely not going to be considered a custom client object. You can use that in whatever you make, and you 99 times out of 100, you won't get flagged. It's not going to be a custom client object. But just know that pretty much everything else in the series, if you follow the tutorial, it will be considered a custom client object, and you will not be able to submit it to J2H unless you are a verified builder. And with that, that is the conclusion of our first tutorial. The rest of the tutorials in this series are going to be more script-based for sure, so just look out for that. This was kind of just get your toes wet into what a custom client object is. Next tutorial, we're going to be talking about touch events and player detection. Should be fun. All right, see you then.